So I wouldn't be surprised if just hours after this video uploads that we get a verdict on the Bulls tampering investigation as it relates to Lonzo Ball's free agency, because I feel every time that I come out with a video on a given topic that is currently in a waiting period, an hour later we get our answer. That happened when the Bulls finally traded Lauri Markkanen, and then it also happened when the Bulls quickly filled the remainder of their roster by signing Stanley Johnson and Alice Johnson. So don't be shocked if this video quickly becomes dated, but I'm gonna make it anyway. And you very well might be watching this and the outcome has already been revealed, or who knows, maybe I'm speaking it into existence right now. But in today's video, I want to talk about what is going on with Lonzo Ball and the tampering investigation, as it has now been over a month since the league announced that they would be investigating the moves made by the Bulls and the Miami Heat into potential tampering violations. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Guys, real quick, if you missed my last video, I was incredibly fortunate enough to meet with former Chicago Bull and member of the famous bench mob, Ronnie Brewer. We discussed his time with the Bulls in the height of the D-Rose era, as well as his thoughts on the Bulls offseason moves. So make sure you check it out and give Ronnie a follow on Twitter. Show him some love for taking time out of his day to meet with everyday fans like myself. So feel free to check out the video. I'll leave it linked in the description as well as on the end screen of this video. But with that said, let's get back into the topics. So I know a lot of you guys have been asking me about what's the latest with this investigation. Is it still ongoing or is it done? Well, I can tell you your guess is as good as mine on what the status of it is, but what I can tell you is that the investigation is most certainly still ongoing. I think there was a misconception that when the Bulls officially signed Lonzo and welcomed him to the team, that the investigation was somehow over. That is certainly not the case at all, and I know some have still been asking, if it is ongoing, does that mean that it's possible that the league can void the sign and trade and that we lose Lonzo Ball? Well, I can say with a certainty that Lonzo isn't going anywhere. He is going to be a Chicago Bull whether the Bulls are found guilty of any wrongdoing in the investigation or not. He's already signed with the team. He's already been welcomed by the team. He's working out with the team. There is no going back on that. So hopefully that gives Bulls fans some peace of mind anyway. But it does mean that the Bulls are not immune from any penalties. It's very possible they could be fined and potentially have to forfeit draft picks as a result. We saw that with the case with the Milwaukee Bucks last season when they had to forfeit a second-round pick and get hit with a fine when it was revealed that they had tampered when trying to execute a sign-and trade for Bogdan Bogdanovic, who ultimately ended up going to the Atlanta Hawks. Now, how did all of this happen? Well, I'm sure most of you remember, but in case you don't, when free agency opened at 6 p.m. Eastern time on August 2nd, meaning the time when teams and players are now allowed and open and able to negotiate contracts, the very first signing that was announced publicly was that Lonzo Ball was signing with the Bulls. Now, it wasn't immediately announced that it was a sign and trade, but rather that the Bulls had made an offer to Lonzo Ball, and it was then shortly revealed that this transaction was going to be done by way of a sign-and trade where the Bulls would trade Tomas Satoransky, Garrett Temple, and a second-round pick to the Pelicans in exchange for Lonzo Ball. Now, what was wrong with that, you ask? I mean, it was announced after the free agency opening period. That happens all the time, every year in NBA free agency, and yes, you would be correct. There really is nothing wrong with that. And virtually every team tampers, because how on earth would a team and player not be able to interact whatsoever beforehand, and then the second free agency opens, they instantly come to an agreement, and it's already notified to the media in a matter of minutes, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But the reason this one was a little more fishy and made the move a little more blatant and suspicious was the fact that this was a sign and trade. And when doing a sign and trade, those transactions are considerably more complex to complete, because you have multiple parties negotiating and agreeing to all of the moving parts, rather than just, say, a straight offer to a free agent and the free agent agrees to that deal. In this instance of this transaction, the Bulls had to work with the Pelicans and Lonzo Ball and his agent on a contract agreement in which the Pelicans would sign him, but then trade him to the Bulls, while also working with Garrett Temple and his agent to a contract extension, because people forget Temple was actually a free agent. He was only on a one-year deal under the Bulls. Not only that, but it would also take time to negotiate with the Pelicans what they also would want in return for a sign and trade, which in this instance, the Bulls threw in Satoransky and a second-round pick. So a lot of moving parts for something to be figured out and resolved in a matter of 3 minutes, which is when the move was announced by the media. Now, what bothers me about this investigation, and really bothers me about the league in general, is that they are never consistent in the way they hand down various punishments, penalties, or reprimands. No, they pick and choose who to make an example out of, because as I said before, the fact of the matter is every single team in the NBA has tampered at some point. It's a precedent that has almost been set that if you're not tampering, You're not gaming the system as a GM to give your franchise a leg up when you're going into free agency. Every season for as long as I can remember, transactions, signings have always been announced just minutes after the free agency period opens. Minutes. Not all transactions, of course, but there are a handful that come out just shortly after that free agency period opens. Now, you could argue, well, for those that are announced minutes after free agency, it's possible a team made them an offer and it was just so good that the player agreed right away, and they didn't in fact start talking before free agency. They didn't go through any sort of negotiations. They agreed to it right away. Sure, but come on now. With every contract and agreement in the NBA, there is at least a little bit of negotiating. Not only that, but the fact that it has already been agreed and then shared with the media for them to pick it up and tweet the move in the span of just a few minutes. An offer is made to a player, the offer is accepted, and then right away, the team notifies the media of the agreement. That's a lot happening in just the span of a few minutes. So clearly, there are discussions happening behind the scenes, and it's been going on for years. Well, the league has now decided they're going to be cracking down on this since it's becoming more blatantly obvious that teams and players are tampering, and they decided to nitpick the Bulls transaction for Lonzo Ball specifically. Now, I will say the Bulls could have been a little smarter and at least holding off for a few hours before announcing the sign and trade for Lonzo. Like, even if you did come into an agreement, don't share it with the media or even announce it to the league office right away. However, because AK and Mark Eversley strike me as two very smart and calculated men, I don't think it was them that leaked this signing. I think they're smart enough to realize that something like that being announced right when free agency opens definitely looks a little suspect. And I know there have been a lot of theories on who potentially leaked this information, but to me, I think it's pretty clear that Rich Paul of Clutch Sports jumped the gun on this one and wanted it to be known that one of their biggest clients, at least in terms of name recognition anyway, had signed with one of the biggest markets in the league, and that they were done with the nonsense going on in New Orleans. And I'm sure both the Bulls front office and the Pelicans front office were furious when they saw that this was announced. And I really don't think Clutch is out of the woods as it relates to this investigation, and they may even be slapped with some fines and penalties for tampering in this deal as well. But at the end of the day, the teams themselves are going to be handed the biggest penalties, especially if it is in the form of losing draft picks. Now, the other theory, which I love and think is hilarious, and to be honest, it's probably not too far off from potentially being the case, but it's that the ghost of Gar Forman's past is still haunting us in Chicago, and that he's the one who snitched to the league office that the Bulls front office had tampered in this transaction. Because if you remember, Gar, after being fired by the Bulls to their GM, has now taken a role with the Pelicans in scouting, and I'm sure there is some resentment and bitterness towards the organization that gave him the boot, and of course the fan base that constantly criticized him for how he handled the Bulls organization, especially towards the end of his tenure. So maybe as a big FU, he snitched on the Bulls and said they tampered in this deal. I mean, I think it's a pretty big stretch, but not out of the realm of possibility. It's also possible that the Pelicans as a whole just got bitter because they lost out on Lonzo, thinking that they're going to go after Kyle Lowry and bring him in, and then the Miami Heat swoop in and take Lowry, which, surprise, surprise, the Heat are also under investigation. And then, of course, the Pelicans, after all of that, were left with Devontae Graham, which isn't a terrible option, but come on, he's not moving the needle for the Pelicans, and it's definitely not something to keep Zion happy and wanting to stay in New Orleans long term. But no matter what theory you want to believe in terms of who leaked the potential tampering that was involved in this transaction, the fact of the matter is the Bulls are being investigated, and if I'm going to be honest, it doesn't look good in terms of them being relieved of any wrongdoing, because like every other team that tampered before free agency officially began, the Bulls are now under the microscope, and it will likely surface that some sort of tampering did in fact take place unless they somehow came to an agreement before the trade deadline that they would make this deal in the offseason and to hold off on those conversations until free agency starts. But I really can't see that happening because so many things can change in terms of a player's performance from the trade deadline all the way to free agency. And if the Bulls are found guilty of tampering, the league is going to make an example out of them and throw down some hard penalties. I'm talking in the form of large fines from the organization, including individual fines to the front office, even temporary suspensions for AK and Eversley, and of course the potential of losing multiple future draft picks, which of course why that is so key for the Bulls to get that first round pick in the market and sign and trade so that they could use that as insurance in the event the investigation doesn't go in their favor, especially since the Bulls have limited first-round picks as it is, which would still be unfortunate, even if the Bulls did have to give up their first-round pick from the Blazers for absolutely nothing. Like, it's one thing to trade a first-round pick when you're getting assets in return, like the Bulls did in bringing in Vucevic and DeRozan, but to lose a first-round pick because of being caught tampering, that's a pretty big blow. And the fines, obviously, we don't care about as much as fans because it's not our pocketbooks and it's not impacting the team's salary cap, but the draft picks would hurt. And at this point, all we can do is wait and see what happens. My guess is we'll get some sort of verdict on this investigation in the next week or two, or like I said, maybe in the next couple of hours. You would have to think that this would need to be resolved before training camp begins. But let me know what you guys are thinking, though. Do you think that the Bulls will in fact be found guilty in this investigation, or do you think the league will come back having found no wrongdoing on the part of the Bulls? Let me know in the comments, and as always, guys, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.